Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm always delighted to be in this corner of the world. I should have a presentation. Is it on? Okay, great. So I'm here today to take you to Italy to see the language rights that our minority language communities have in Italy. I'll be talking a bit about language development in Italy with a focus on the Central Alpine Arc and on a bit on legal and administrative terminology, because that is the domain I work in Northern Italy, in South Tyrol, for German. So we'll see a bit about how many and where how many minority language communities we have in Italy, where they are. We'll see the legal framework together. We'll see the two possible classifications that are usually used in Italy. I'll try and give you very quickly 3 examples of language development situations for 3 very different language minorities in Italy. We'll see some problematic issues together before I conclude. So in Italy there are at least 12 different language groups, 13 with Italian, so at least 12 different minority language groups. We do not have official data, we do not have recent data. These estimates, so the 2.5 million, date back to the 1990s. And you see from the map that they are mainly in outlying positions in Italy for historic and geographic reasons. The Italian legal system recognizes the right to be different, and it also recognizes the right of the members of a minority language community to be treated as part of a minority or not. You're free to choose. It is a promotional legal system like the Spanish one with positive protection. So it doesn't just state the fact that you shouldn't be discriminated because you speak another language, but it puts in place specific measures to protect language minorities. And there isn't just the individual protection of the single person that should not be discriminated, but the language community as such has also collective rights. Protection in Italy is asymmetric. That means that different situations are protected in different ways. And this is the positive aspect, but we also have the negative aspect that similar situations are treated in different ways. In Italy, there must be 3 criteria in place to be recognized as a language minority. Minorities in Italy are always language-based for legislation. So the Italian legislation very rarely uses the adjective ethnic, really only just at local level, because obviously the idea was to try and avoid possible political, international, racial conflicts. So language minorities are only language minorities. There is a very strong territorial-based protection, so protection is linked very closely to a specific geographic area. You know that situation, we've also seen it right now. And a final formal criterion is that the group has to be protected formally in some law or some disposition. The Italian constitution is sometimes called the Constitution of Minorities because it deals with language and minority-related issues in 2 articles among the 12 fundamental principles of the Italian constitution. So Article 3 states that you shouldn't be discriminated if you speak a different language, and it goes on stating then in the second paragraph that it is the duty of the Italian Republic to remove any obstacles that are in place for the full enjoyment of this equal status. And Article 6 is dedicated specifically to language minorities and states that they should be protected. Interestingly, the Italian constitution never states Italian as a national language. That provision is hidden for the first time in one of the special autonomy statutes. You might know that the big minorities in Italy, in northern Italy, so the French and Franco-Provençal speaking minority in Aosta, the German and partly Ladin speaking minority in South Tyrol, and the Slovene speaking minority to the east are protected by specific autonomy statutes that date back to the 50s and partly to the 60s. Now, Italian stated as a national language is stated for the first time in 1948 in the regional autonomy statute for South Tyrol. And it is the first time that there is this disposition. Well, that autonomy statute is not in place anymore. because it wasn't very effective in practical protection. It stated in theory a series of rights, but we couldn't really implement it, so there was a period of fierce political quarrels, discussions, even a series of bombings and attacks. And after that, in 1972, we received a new autonomy statute. And from that moment on, German and Italian were really stated as equal in South Tyrol. Obviously, Italian remains the official language of the state. And one interesting thing is that if there is a law drafted in German and Italian, and the two versions sort of might lead to diverging interpretations, Italian is the authentic language. So the two languages are equal, but Italian is still a bit more equal than German. And funny enough, 70% of the speakers in South Tyrol are native German speakers. So is the government. So most of our legislation today is written in German. That means that the authentic language is a translation. And for me as a translator, this is a very particular and probably unique situation. Now, another very important disposition for all the others, or many others, many other minority language communities in Italy dates back to 1999. And it lists a series of 12 minority language communities, again stating Italian as the national language. But it comes in 1999. So 50 years after the Constitution. How many generations of speakers of minority languages can you lose in 50 years? 2, maybe 3, who knows? So it was a belated protection. There was and still is limited funding connected to that law. It hasn't proven very effective for revitalization of the use of smaller languages. Interestingly, the recognition must come from the speakers. So at least 50% of the population in one municipality, or a third of the municipal councillors, have to apply for minority language status. And then it is granted. What is positive is that the law states that minority languages can be taught in schools, they can be used in public with the public administration, the place names in the local languages can be added to the official Italian ones, and then there are specific funds for so-called language tellers, which are local contact points where the members speaking a minority language can go and receive information on what is going on in their municipality, on legislation, on dispositions, or on national legislation in their own language. And the tellers are also responsible for translating laws or other material into the minority languages. And then there are local, regional, provincial laws coming later and giving a stronger, better protection to specific minorities. One exemplary one is the one from our neighboring province, Trentino. There are 3 minority language communities in the province of Trento, about 6,000 Ladin speakers speaking a Romance language, and 2 very small minorities speaking 2 ancient Bavarian dialects. So 1,600 speakers of Mokino and 3 to 600, not 1,000, 3 to 600 speakers of Cimbro. And that law in Trentino recognizes them as an inalienable heritage of the entire provincial community, uses the terminology that you are used to here in Spain, so it talks about lingua propria, so own language, and it is a very empowering law because it gives rights, it gives the possibility of teaching the language in school, it gives a lot of funding, it gives clear and definite and sure representation and participation to the members of the minority language communities, and definitely gives rights but also duties. So it is a really empowering legislation. In Italy, we tend to use 2 different typologies for our minority languages, one more from a linguistic point of view, one more from a legal point of view. The linguists talk about national minorities, so those that have a kin state outside Italy, so Austria for us South Tyroleans, or modern Slovenia for the Slovene speakers to the east. And these are also the so-called super protected minorities in the classification of the legal experts. Because in these regions, the languages are really co-official, are used with the public administration, are used in court, are taught in school, and have a really sort of high status. And then going back to the classification of the linguists, there are regional languages that are spoken in specific parts and regions of Italy, like Friulian, about 600,000 speakers, so also big minorities, Ladin, or also regional languages that are spoken not only in Italy, but also, for instance, in France, like the Occitan or Franco-Provençal groups. And then there are language colonies, sometimes also called language islands, because they're small, because they're isolated, and because many times there really are real colonization dating back to the 13th, 14th, 15th century, like miners and farmers from Bavaria called to work in a specific secluded valley of the Alps, or people fleeing from religious persecution, for instance, the Albanian fleeing from the Turks from Albania at the time. And most of these are so-called recognized minorities with potential protection, because they're protected by the law from 1999, and there is the system where you have to apply for recognition. And then we have non-recognized minorities in Italy. So we definitely have more than 12 minority language communities. For instance, the Roma and Sinti population, the Armenian diaspora, the sign language speakers, the new minorities. They are not linked to a specific territory, to a specific geographic area, so they are not entitled to protection as of today. There are also big differences between the protection that there is between the single minorities. Now, you don't need to read all of this, just see that the list to the right pertains to the French or better Franco-Provençal speaking minority in Aosta, and is shorter than the list that is related to the German-speaking population in South Tyrol. We are the minority with the best protection in Italy. Our list is definitely longer. So both of us can use, French and respectively German in court, in public. There are schools, we can use it at school. There's media and everything. But we use the system of separation of language groups. So we have, for instance, German schools with German as a medium of instruction where Italian is taught as a second language. Whereas in Val d'Aosta they have 50-50 French and Italian schools. They can have French-only place names. We always use both place names. One thing we have and they don't have, for instance, is a strict separation of language groups also in public employment. So places in public employment are distributed strictly according to the percentage distribution of language groups on the territory. That means that in public employment there will be 70% of German native speakers, 25% of Italian native speakers, and the rest Latin speakers. And how do we know how many German speakers and Italian speakers we have in South Tyrol? Well, every 10 years we have to declare which language groups we belong to, but we can choose only one. Now imagine if you are like I, who am half Latin, half Italian, half German because I grew up in a German-speaking village and went to German schools and wasn't good at maths. It's difficult to choose. And it's very debated, so it's called ethnic proportion. And this is what it looks like in practice. So, to the right, Val d'Aosta, they use French or Italian accordingly. They could also have French-only legislation. We cannot do that. We always have to have at least an Italian version. And we keep all the languages present. This example comes from the trilingual area, where they also speak Latin, but always present, but always separate. So, two super-protected minorities, but different approaches. A quick word on the language development in South Tyrol. We're used to use standard German as a reference language for everything. At school, in the media, it's always been like that. We never use it when we speak. We use our local German dialect, but we use standard German as a reference language. And when we received the right to use German, also in court and with the public administration, we thought it was no problem, easy peasy. But very soon we realized that we could do it for everything, but not for legal and administrative language. Because that is system-bound, that is very closely linked to the specific legal system that has produced it. The legal systems are different. I cannot just borrow terms from Germany and Austria and use it for the Italian legal system because the system is different there. Okay, so we had a problem there. And what we had to do in the last 30 to 40 years is terminology work. What we did is always take the concepts of the Italian legal system and compare them, do real legal comparison with the concepts used in Austria, in Germany, in Switzerland, at EU level for certain domains, and see, does this Italian legal concept exist in Austria? Is it the same concept? Can I use that term for South Tyrol to designate an Italian legal concept? Yes, no. And all this work is published online in our terminology database, Bistro. And there is a lot of work there, and it's also served as a basis for terminology standardization for about 20 years. For about 20 years, we had a terminology commission who officially standardized equivalence between the Italian legal terminology and the South Tyrolean German legal terminology. That means that they published lists stating that whenever you have term A in Italian, you will have to use term B in German for South Tyrol. And this standardized about 7,300 terms in the 20 years, because there were only 6. Only 3 of them were German native speakers. They were working on a voluntary basis. They had a very cumbersome legal procedure. It took them like 2 years to come out with a new list. So it was a very problematic way of approaching this standardization work. And one thing they did was also batch standardizing some legal codes that had been translated starting from the 70s, when we received the right to do it. But what happened at the time? We were in an emergency. Okay, we can use German now. Oh, okay, everyone started translating. Without coordination, in different groups, so the criminal code was translated by a different group than the civil code. But you know, partly the terminology corresponds. If you don't do this work together, if you don't follow the same scientific approach, and they were following, it was good people and experienced people, they were following scientific approaches, but different ones. So we've been living in a terminological chaos for many, many years, and standardization work took part of that away, but not everything. Just one example. The police headquarters are called questura in Italian. And what we South Tyroleans did immediately is translating this into German by stating we can use it questur. You know, take the last vowel away and put an umlaut on top of it. That's German. But we soon realized that it's not really German and that no one understands us outside South Tyrol. You know? And the problem is we are 300,000, there's another 60 million German speakers out there. We wanted to avoid excessive regionalization of our language. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel every single time. So that's why we did the legal comparison. Now, the examples you see with the asterisk are the ones that are officially standardized and used today, and the work of the Terminology Commission managed to take a lot of this uncertainty away. We still have it. You know, their work was too long, it took too long. We now need to be much, much quicker. So we don't do the standardization anymore, but what we do is the same, and it's still available online immediately. You know, whenever Rome passes a new law, for instance, on same-sex marriages in Italy, we elaborate the terminology immediately. Differences are also exist between the regional minorities, so the recognized minorities with potential protection. One clear example is the Ladin one. They live in 3 different administrative areas, 2 into autonomous areas, 1 in a non-autonomous area. And you can well imagine, you know, in Bolzano, they have a very similar protection to the German-speaking population. So basically, they locally have trilingualism. They have Ladin legislation. They can use it everywhere. They have it at school. In Trento, there is a medium protection from this exemplary local law, and in Belluno, a very weak one, because it only dates, you know, it only refers to this 1991 law. So same language group, but different protections. And that's what it looks like for these regional languages in practice. So the top example on the left-hand side comes from Sardinia, and you clearly see that the Sardinian place name has been added later in a second moment, and it's also sort of confusing. You go like, is it the same place or is it another thing? Second example on the bottom shows you why these languages are sometimes called languages in brackets, because the local place name has been added in brackets after the official Italian, or in this case, this is an example from Val d'Aosta in French. One example on Ladin language development, we've said it's very very different. There are 5 Ladin variants, 3 language institutes, grammars and dictionaries for every variant, even online material. In South Tyrol, we have been doing terminology projects, developing administrative terminology, both at URC and today the provincial office who translates the legislation into Ladin is still going on, and it's still published in Bistro, not standardized, but it's still published online. And again, as I said, they have a full protection, more or less like the German-speaking minority in South Tyrol. In Trentino, they have been doing projects on neology, especially also on, partly also not on administrative terminology. And there is a more recent law, which hasn't been implemented yet because they had local elections last year. So, you know, during elections, nothing happens. But that states that the development of administrative terminology should be fostered, and there's funds to do that. So they also have, you know, they use it in kindergarten, it's used in school at all levels. It's quite a good situation, especially in Trentino. They have done a lot of natural language processing projects. They have an automatic translator, for instance. Well, it's more like a morphological translator from Italian to Latin, but still, you know, they're doing a lot of these things. Whereas in Belluno, you know, there's first attempts of starting to teach the language in elementary school, not much more than that. Another quick example on Mokeno, which is, if you remember, as I told you, this ancient Bavarian dialect spoken in 3 villages in a secluded valley of Trentino. They call their language Versentolerisch. They have a common grammar. You know, there's actually 3 micro variants because there's 3 villages, and they have managed to develop a common grammar and common standard. The Ladins haven't managed to do that. It's used in kindergarten, it's taught at elementary school, but they also use German as a medium, standard German as a medium of instruction in school. The language tellers are in place. The Cultural Institute is doing work on neology, also administrative terminology, but I know that the language is not very much used at local level in the municipal councils, for instance, because the councillors are all locals, they speak the language. It's a community where it's still very much spoken, or at least understood, but the secretary comes from outside. So everyone uses Italian, or the local Italian dialect. Like the Ladins, they have this exam for sort of checking the knowledge and the level of knowledge of the local language. It's a serious exam. I mean, it's written and it's oral, and there's different languages. We have that in South Tyrol too for German. And you won't receive any public employment unless you have it. In Val d'Aosta, they have one for French, but not everyone has to take it. The South Tyrolean Ladins have a similar exam and no public employment without it. In Trentino, both for the Ladins and for the Mokeni, if you pass the exam and you're already in public employment, you will get higher wages. So that is a sort of incentive of passing it. And if you are a candidate to a position and you have the exam, then you will be preferred to other candidates. Open issues. We've seen that there are unprotected language minorities, so the Roma, the new minorities, different protections in different areas for one and the same language group. What about all the other regional languages in Italy, you know? Can you state that Sicilian and Venetian, who have even a big and important literary tradition in those languages, are dialects of Standard Italian, which is Tuscan-based? You can't really. So why is Venetian not protected? Why is Friulian protected? Historical reasons, political reasons. Another open question is, does it make sense to use the modern standard languages as reference languages for the small Italian minorities who have always been diglossic and have always used Italian as their reference language for administrative purposes, for instance? The Mokeni accept standard German, and in Trentino they draft the local legislation in standard German for them, even though they also use Mokeno at local level. But other communities, like the Albanian one, don't do it. The own initiative system, partly called what we call ethno-business, that is municipalities where the language is not spoken anymore or has never been spoken, applying for minority status and receiving it from the government, you know, without a scientific check on that. Big problem is the lack of qualified staff, both at school and in public administration. And a very peculiar South Tyrolean situation is that this system of language separation, you know, having schools with German as a main medium of instruction and teaching Italian as a second language is not making our competence in the national language better. On the contrary, our kids leave high school with a B1 level in their national language, and that is not enough. So you can live a life in South Tyrol without ever having to use Italian, and that's maybe, I don't know whether this is really always an advantage. We're definitely not an endangered minority anymore, so that will probably change sooner or later, not so quickly because it's political, but sooner or later this will change. And now with this I'm concluding. We've seen that basically all language minorities, even the super protected ones in Italy, received language rights without the means for practical implementation. So for instance, without having legal and administrative terminology ready. And that posed serious problems for all of us. Another open issue is how useful is it to have these language tellers as sort of, you know, translation and interpreting agencies for members of small minorities who speak perfect Italian? Is that a real, you know, does it really make sense at a certain point of development of the minority language, using it in legislation where no one uses it at school? One thing that has been postulated is that it does make sense if the people are able to read and write in their minority language. Then you will discuss things on the media in the minority language, and it will be administrative stuff, legal stuff, and this will also bring the members of the community to learn this terminology. You know, so these language rights, they trigger language development and standardization in the minority languages because you start developing terminology, and starting from a certain point, it also helps people learning new words in their language because, you know, we don't use that much agricultural terminology as my grandmother used to do. We need different terminology today. And this is my thank you in the regional and minority languages of South Tyrol and Trentino. Looking for all the Italian ones will have been, you know, too much work. And if anyone is interested in bibliography, I have a host of it, so just ask me. And that's it from my part.
Thank you very much.